Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for VMware Backups. My name's Rick Vanover, and I'm a Product Strategy Specialist at Veeam Software, and I'm happy to talk to you about this topic today. I work at Veeam, but this topic is going to talk a little bit about Veeam's offering for backups for VMware, as well as some general topics that can help you in whatever you're doing. So we're going to talk a little bit about both ends of the spectrum today. If you're not familiar with Veeam, I do encourage you to check us out at veeam.com, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Veeam or myself at Rick Vanover. So let's go ahead and get started with a few administrative points about today's webinar. First of all, we're going to kind of focus a lot around vSphere, and specific the challenges around having vSphere in regards to the protection strategy that all of us probably face. We are also going to talk about how Veeam can help and some specific scenarios that even if you're not using Veeam, you might even be able to take some of these best practices with you in what you're doing. We do want to position Veeam as modern data protection that will help you in your vSphere environment, and that it's powerful, easy to use, and affordable. And that's kind of an important aspect of what we do. And then also our free offerings. In fact, all of our product lines now have a free offering, and we can't make it any easier for you to give it a try. We'd hope you like it. Towards the end of the webinar, I have some time dedicated towards Q&A. And if you have a question, go ahead and ask the question in the little GoToWebinar panel. Now, if I see your question, if I can answer it while we're going through the content, I'll do my best. But I will have to possibly hold on to it until the end of the webinar. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so you will get a link to replay the webinar and download the PowerPoint slides, and that'll be sent to you via email a few days after the completion of today's webinar. Now lastly, I do encourage everyone to stick around because at the end of the webinar, I am going to draw let's see, how many people? We've got a good number of people online today. I'm going to draw seven lucky winners who will win a free book. We've got a great offering of virtualization and IT-related books. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to ask you one question. And actually, the answer is going to be one word, so I know the question already. I'm going to ask one question at the end of the webinar, and 7 lucky people will win a book. So let's jump into it. This is a very loaded topic. First thing we're going to talk about, what's most important with virtualization? Storage, disk systems. We all know that. My personal journey of virtualization actually introduced me, in my experience, to shared storage. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. So when it comes to backups, we have to really think a lot about our storage beforehand. Okay? So let's talk about performance first of all. There's no way to, I'm not telling you something you don't know, basically. There's no way to dodge this topic. Storage performance is very important for virtualization. Now when it comes to backups, we want to make sure that we don't find things like the I/O tipping point. What I mean by that is, depending on how you do your backups, you might cause problems to come up, right? Like, okay, so I have my virtual machines, and now I'm going to start my backup process, and that might send additional I/O burden on my storage. And maybe that's because I haven't installed enough separation. I'll talk more about separation in a bit. In fact, that's probably the most frequent word I'm going to use here today. But things like Exchange servers, right? They might be important if you've loaded up a database on one disk system, and if you are doing a backup and it's a very large Exchange server, it might be impactful on the storage. So I like to separate things as much as possible, and I got the Exchange example up there as just one in particular. So we can have a database on one volume that's very large, or we can have on one virtual machine, or we can have multiple virtual machines with multiple databases that are all more manageable size. Personally, I like the latter because we can have a distributed Exchange environment with more separation between the large data profile. All of that being said, we need tools and we need visibility. So measuring things within our storage can actually impact how we go about our backups. I have 3 things that I like to use the most: IOPS, latency, and free space. And actually, I put them in that order because they're very sophisticated, from more sophisticated to less sophisticated. If you're just looking at free space, you're going to be in trouble. But if you're able to have visibility into IOPS, chances are you'll be in good shape. Latency is kind of that middle of the road measure. It's a good measure. It takes a little bit more digging to the disk resource to see what it's capable of and what's normal. But I like using all 3 of these indicators as a general rule, and there are a number of specific storage measurements, but it's very important to have this visibility, because if not, like I say, the I/O tipping point will be discovered. And the I/O tipping point is basically once you start doing something and doing something more, you then push the storage system to a situation where, while it still works, the performance is something that you notice and it's negative. So a lot of discussion around storage, but the one thing I want to really ingrain in everyone's memory is separation. Separation is the most important thing when it comes to backups. Let me give you the best example, and that's taking your backups from one, say, VMware data store and putting it on the same data store. Okay, of course, that's not a good idea in case you lose the data store. You could apply that to multiple domains of failure. If you have one disk tray and then you're backing up from that disk tray to another disk tray, but they're on the same SAN controller, you see the domain of failure is that SAN controller. You could even go one step higher. One fiber channel SAN to another fiber channel SAN, but they're on the same fabric. What if the switches fail? So you have, you can just keep on going down down the line of domains of failure, but with whatever you have, my recommendation is a best practice is to have as much separation as possible between your primary virtual machines, which we're monitoring and we're having this visibility for performance, and separation to where we put our backups. Now, the separation will help us one of 2 ways. It'll actually help us in terms of domains of failure, but it'll also help out this performance discussion. Basically, if we're reading from one place and writing right back to it for our backups, however they're done, right? Take Veeam out of the question. If you read from and write to the same spot, that's going to be an adverse performance indicator. So separation is going to help you 2 ways: protection and performance. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But when we talk about separation and where we want to put our backups, one question that I always have to field, and what I do, is really address where do I put my backups, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the transport modes in a second, but there's a lot of factors, and chances are everybody wants all of them. Yes, I want deduplication. Yes, I want cost efficiency. Yes, I want high capacity, and yes, I want ultimate performance. The reality is that we can't always do everything, okay? So deduplication is a big topic, right? And Veeam has an answer around deduplication. I'll just mention that right now. And that's basically to use Veeam's deduplication for a backup job. So if we're backing up n number of virtual machines, we deduplicate across all those virtual machines. And that's really good stuff. When we deduplicate, if we have multiple jobs, Veeam by itself does not deduplicate across those jobs, but I have a low-cost answer to that, and that's Windows Server 2012 deduplication. And beyond that, there are plenty of disk resources, Exagrid, data domain, plenty of other targets that have a hardware deduplication. HP Store Once, there's a million of those types of products. So if deduplication is a priority, right? In Veeam's world, we have a no-cost option, which is built in with our jobs. The low-cost addition, which would be a Windows Server 2012 repository, and then more sophisticated solutions like hardware appliances. Side note, those hardware appliances can receive backup data from other products, and so can Windows Server 2012 for that matter. So, if you have a lot of things going on, and I realize the average company has 2.4 or 2.3, I can't remember the number, backup products. So if you have a lot of things going on, that might be a factor. Cost, getting the money for storage is the hard part. Getting storage isn't the hard part. So when we talk about where are we going to put our backups, I personally like to start with disk, which might be disk to tape, disk to another disk to cloud, a lot of different arrangements, but I always like that first one being disk, so disk to something else possibly. There's cost to disk, right? Sometimes people want to go directly to tape, and there's performance considerations with that. Plus, personally, I don't know that many people who really like tape. So those are a lot of priorities also. And capacity is probably the next one. So, if you have to balance all of these priorities, I might have the money for this much storage of this performance, or I could take that same purchase power and get less capacity but higher performance, right? These are some of the decisions I'm sure you've had to make. It's really tough, is what I'm trying to say, to kind of prioritize these because you want them all, and I want them all too, for that matter. So whenever you design around whatever storage resource you have, a couple of things come into play. First of all is separation. Again, separation comes up. When we talk about where this disk resource would reside, ideally it's as far away with the highest performance possible from the source. A good example is within a rack. If you have a data center rack and then you have a SAN, even just a modular SAN, which is like 1 or 2 drive trays or something, if you put the backup storage right underneath of it, that's good unless the rack falls over or is flooded, that particular rack gets rained on, the ceiling leaks or something like that. So again, the domain of failure comes in. So as much separation as possible could be putting it on the other side of the data center, on the other side of the building, maybe if you have a data center closet. Little things like that are a best practice separation. And then when it comes to how these backups are communicated, some details, and we're going to talk about these in a second, of transport modes. For our virtual machine backups, we want to make sure we have the best performance coming into these disk resources so that we don't burden our VMware environment that much, and then don't do too much excessive I/O or long-running process onto our backup targets. A lot of things come into play. So in terms of, sorry, this is a little bit out of, I seem to have lost a slide here. There it is. Sorry about that. When we talk about where our backups will reside, we have to answer our question, of where they're going to go, but we also have to identify how are they going to get there. Now, we in the VMware world have 3 major options specifically for very specific VMware technologies. Now, there's a 4th option, okay, and that's doing agent-based backups. Now, if you're not familiar with Veeam, we don't provide an agent-based backup, which is why I haven't talked about it here. So you could treat your VMware virtual machine like a physical server. Personally, I'm not a fan of that approach. Veeam's product doesn't go that route either. So that being said, I want to talk about the 3 very VMware-specific options. The first of which is direct SAN access, and I'm starting with that one because that's my favorite. Now, direct SAN access is provided by the Virtual Disk Development Kit, or the vStorage APIs for data protection is probably a better parent family of technologies where this comes from. These frameworks that are provided by VMware vSphere allow backup vendors and other things for that matter, like maybe some of the virtual appliances that are out there, or storage virtualization technologies, etc. A lot of things could use this. But basically, these APIs in this framework allow us and other VMware backup-specific products to communicate directly to the storage for a backup. Now, that's real important. So what happens here is when a backup happens, and let's take a fiber channel iSCSI example for this first case. the data is read directly from the LUN or the iSCSI target. And then something like Veeam picks it up directly from there and puts it into the disk repository that we talked about just a second ago. So the good thing here is that if enough separation is in place, meaning I've put my Veeam infrastructure or my backup infrastructure for that matter separated enough from the production element of my vSphere environment that there's no performance impact, then I can actually do a lot of good things. I can actually avoid using the network from my backup, so LAN free from a backup standpoint. I can also avoid cluttering the multipathing on my ESXi servers. So because I'm coming through the backup server's own path, I don't have to worry about that. And if you put in even more separation, you can even take away the CPU hit. So I talked about deduplication earlier. Big resource for that is deduplication, and that's the way Veeam implements it as well. A lot of hashing and checksumming going on disk regions, and that takes CPU. So if I can take all of that away from my core cluster, now I could still do this as a virtual machine. Don't say that I have to install Veeam as a physical machine then. I can still make it a virtual machine, but maybe I'll put it on the dev cluster, or maybe I'll put it on a free ESXi, put my Veeam proxies and Veeam server over there just to run, not to back up from, but to run there, right? A lot of options, right? So you can really separate some of your production infrastructure to really dial up some ultimate performance. And that's direct SAN access, and that's my favorite way to go. The middle one here is Virtual Appliance Hot Add. Now this is an NFS. It can be iSCSI and Fiber Channel as well, but for NFS, this is one of the best options as well. Virtual Appliance Hot Add actually co-maps a virtual machine to the backup server at the same time so that you can avoid spending so much I/O going over the network. And of course, in the NFS realm, there's no direct SAN. So Virtual Appliance Hot Add is a little bit different if you've not ever seen it. So I do have a graphic here. So this kind of helps visualize it here. So on the left, that virtual machine is what we're backing up with Virtual Appliance Hot Add. And he has, that virtual machine has this mapping directly to the VMDK file at the bottom here. And over on the right, the backup server will have a temporary mapping basically directly to that virtual machine. Now the magic is, usually with Hot Add there's a snapshot, a virtual machine snapshot that's taken. It's later removed, so it's not, the snapshot itself is not the backup, it's just part of the backup. But when that snapshot is taken, that first VMDK at the bottom, it's read-only. And so with Hot Add, it allows two different virtual machines, one of them doing the Hot Add work, to map into it. So one little trick here, Hot Add is great, especially if you don't have 10 gigabit Ethernet. Now, the only negative to Hot Add is that there's some API sequencing, right? So I mentioned the VDDK, for example. There's a lot of calls that have to be made to vCenter to make this happen, and then to clean it up at the end. It could be up to a minute or two just of API calls, right? And a lot of things go into timing, so I just throw that out there as a generic answer. But the takeaway is, if there's a lot of data to move, this is a pretty fast data mover, especially when direct SAN access isn't available. Again, I like direct SAN the best, but it's not available in all situations. So that's just kind of good to know. So the third option, I'm back to the other slide here, the third option is network block device or VM kernel. This is basically not using direct SAN, not using Hot Add, and reading the VMDK through the host. Now this isn't necessarily bad, it's just generally speaking, it's not the highest performing. Now if you're using 10 gigabit Ethernet, well, that might be a different story. In fact, if you're using 10 gig Ethernet, this one will fly because there's very little API overhead compared to Hot Add, and of course 10 gig Ethernet is quite quick. So there's some good and bad, but as a general rule, I prefer them left to right. So you still want to have as much separation as possible and have as much performance as possible. But what you'd like to do above all that is have, you know, the separation between these different interfaces to get the most performance, right? So I would go through the drill in your environment and say, which one performs the best? Does direct SAN mode, does hot add, does network mode perform the best? And figure out which way to go. It's hard to make a blanket recommendation, but usually if I would say if you're iSCSI, I would say direct SAN. If you're fiber channel, I would say direct SAN or hot add. If you're NFS, I would say hot add or network mode in those kind of general recommendations. And if you're direct storage, I would say hot add. So as a general rule. Now, here's a best practice that I think can't be stated enough, and that's not to forget virtual machines. Now, if you're like me, when I was an IT admin, it drove me crazy. Someone would deploy an application and they wouldn't tell me it's now production. You know, and I tried to have a pretty good flow from development to production, right? And we didn't promote virtual machines. We actually required our app teams to redeploy code and configuration, right? So we had some good controls around it procedurally, but they still sometimes would use development systems as production or deploy a production system and not tell us everything that they needed backed up, whatever. That's a surprise I don't want to have. And when it comes to agent-based backups, there's a real risk that you don't have it all when you need it if the application team hasn't told you what's going on. And if you're, depending on how you do your VMware environment, you might have intermixed quantities of development and production. And that's a great resource management technique, right? But it's a little bit short on separation, but all virtual machine environments are created equal. I get that. But it becomes really difficult to ensure that everything gets backed up when the resources are intermixed. So VMware actually has a construct, a framework that can really help us out. And this is what I consider my best practice here when it comes to backing up VMware VMs, is to use these constructs. So data stores, folders, vApps, resource pool, whole host, the whole cluster, the whole vCenter. The way that you take this approach, think of it as an inventoried list. So if I'm going to back up VMs in a data store, a folder, a vApp, a resource pool, et cetera, that's going to be a container. That's going to be a dynamic result every time. In fact, my most popular blog post on the Veeam blog last year was something called VM Backups Forget-Me-Not. And that's exactly what I talk about in that blog post. And I have the short URL up there, vee.am/FO. The takeaway is that if we back up by a container, such as a data store, such as a cluster, such as a resource pool, we will accommodate that organic growth. And to me, that's the best safeguard. I love it, and I have an example of that. I'm going to jump into a demo later. I'm going to show it to you. Nonetheless, on to kind of the next best practice is to never forget about our applications, right? That's really what our VMs do. They run apps. So a lot of things go into this because there's a lot of different applications. I'm sure you're aware of that. So what are the boundaries, right? If we can back up a VM and we can do that agentlessly, which is kind of the first kind of decision point I talked about, that sounds great until we start talking to our application people. So what about log truncation? What about granular recovery? What about application consistency? Can you have it all? I believe yes. I have some examples that I can show you, or plenty of Veeam materials on yes. In fact, specifically for VMware, we have this technology called UAIR, Universal Application Item Recovery, and we have some pretty slick things specifically for, say, Exchange Server and for files out of the guest OS, and for SQL Server, Active Directory, domain controllers. We have some wizards and even better than that type of tool in those realms. But then beyond that, Oracle, MySQL, etc., go on down the line. Yes, you can. Now, today, with our virtualization practice, we had two things going on, right? We deploy virtual machines so quick, and we don't necessarily have such a quick recovery expectation, right? But our users do expect that. You know, if we can deploy a VM in an hour, 20 minutes, but it takes me 4 hours to restore, do you see the disconnect? So we can really, if we take the right approach, we can actually bridge that gap. But with our applications, we still need to keep that in mind. So my best practice recommendation related to applications is to ensure that everybody is on the same page. Know what the application options are, right? Because when you go down the agentless route, it's a different game, right? Maybe the app owner needs to put in a script to dump its specific application information on disk, right? Maybe that's part of the solution. So it's not a total under-the-hood thing. You know, as a platform provider with a vSphere environment, we still need to have some interaction with the application owner. So my best practice recommendation is to ensure that application requirements are still met. Aside from that, yet related, is to make sure that there's no guesswork problems or alerts or anything like that, that they're just dismissed. So I like to have good visibility into the changes of vSphere, and then ensure that the backups are accommodated accordingly. Like, good example is somebody added a new data store. So to my previous example of backing up by data store, that's all great until somebody adds a new data store and doesn't tell me if I'm in charge of backups. So have some visibility into that. And when things go wrong, what do, right? If something starts breaking, we start turning off features, right? We kind of simplify the situation. Let's say a good example is something like a backup job fails because it can't log into something. Well, what if I have this option that lets me turn off that logon mechanism and work a different mode, like, say, instead of going application consistent, I can go crash consistent. The job doesn't fail, but the job's not running optimal. Did I go back and fix that? So have some management, some process around it so that we don't have these loose ends go on forever and ever. So that's an important recommendation. And specifically in Veeam Talk, if you're ever diagnosing like a VSS issue, well, the easy thing is just to turn VSS off. But that's not exactly the right thing to do. That might be the right thing to do short term, but let's address that problem long term. Same thing around capacity. Sometimes we have to guess how much capacity do we need for a backup. Well, one way to kind of prevent subsequent guesswork is deduplication. And it could even be used, like I said, with Windows Server 2012 dedupe, where we can land our VMware backups on that type of disk resource, and we can actually deduplicate across Veeam backup jobs which are already deduplicated. So that can be a great space savings technique, especially if you run into a jam down the road. So my best practice recommendation is to not bury things. You know, if there is a problem, get it solved. And then secondly, ensure that the right people are looking at problems, be it alerts, reports, etc., etc. So when it comes to virtual machine backups as a best practice, I'm actually convinced that there's not just one answer. And it could be one product. You know, of course, I'd love that to be Veeam, but it might be a combination of multiple approaches or multiple strategies for the larger virtual machine backup process. So let's take a look at that here. So I have here what I call a layered data protection view, and I've got 7 things. Something as simple as a backup on disk that's on site, and then possibly a virtual machine replica on site. Now, I'm actually not going to talk a lot about replication, but Veeam Backup and Replication also provides a replication engine, and that's a great additional protection technique. In fact, you can do that on-site, off-site, or both for that matter. Right? So right there, that's with a backup and a replica on and off-site. That's 3 layers of protection. We're going to talk a bit about cloud storage here in a second. Tape is an option, and if you have been wondering, Veeam is planning tape support later this year. We are able to talk about that. And we can also talk about SAN Snapshots and off-site disk resources, right? So when you look at it this way, we can really deliver a lot of options, right? Now Veeam can help you into the future tense with all of these, okay? But there's this old adage, which sometimes old adages are just that, they're old, but this one actually still helps, right? There's this old 3-2-1. 3 instances of your data, or your, in this case, virtual machines, running 2 copies on-site, 1 copy off-site, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can actually dial up more than that if you take this layered data protection approach. So my recommendation is, as a best practice, is to have as many protection strategies in play as possible. And Veeam can help you with a lot of these. All of these right now except tape, which will be coming later this year. So I kind of talked a little bit about Veeam and some of these best practices, but it's important to note that a lot of this that I talked about is actually possible with our free tool. So Veeam Backup Free Edition allows you to do all kinds of things. Edit VMX files. Now, don't laugh, but that's actually pretty hard to do without a tool. But basically, we make it a right-click just to edit a VMX file right from the VMFS or NFS data store. The biggest capability within Backup Free Edition is Veeam Zip, however, which is the ability to archive a virtual machine and take it with you, WinZip for your VMs, as it were. But probably the 2 biggest features that come with the Free Edition are Veeam Explorer for Exchange and Veeam Explorer for SAN Snapshots. Those are really powerful features that just came out in our version 6.5 last October. So the takeaway here is that Veeam Explorer for Exchange provides free recovery for Exchange Server emails and discovery techniques as well. It's like Google for your Exchange database is basically what it is. And then you can recover items or whole mailboxes right out of that database. Veeam Explorer for SAN Snapshots is a great way to have additional recovery points throughout the day from the high-efficiency, high-performance engine that comes with in this example with the HP StoreVirtual engine, the left-hand engine, both iSCSI and virtual storage appliance. If you're using those, we can actually recover whole VMs, guest files, and even emails from a SAN snapshot. And those are actually included for free. Good stuff. So I want to take a quick moment and show you some of this stuff. Okay, so let's jump into Veeam Backup and Replication here. And I have my one example that I want to show you. And that's what I call a data store backup. Now, in this particular example here, I have a job, and I just gave it a simple name, Backup Data Store. And look at this. I'm not backing up individual VMs. I mean, I can do that. I can go over here and say, browse VMs. In fact, it'll be that host and clusters view. Right? We all use that to look at our virtual machine environments, where we say host, cluster, and some resource pool, and then the data centers are all populated, et cetera, et cetera. But I like this data store view because I don't have to worry about which VMs are in place, and especially in this environment, I have just a crazy number of virtual machines. How easy is it, and you guys know this, to not know which ones need to be backed up or to not accommodate for all the new ones, right? It happens, they come in. So what I've actually done here, instead of adding individual VMs, just flip it over here so you can see a little bit better, I flipped the view, data stores and VMs. And in that sense, instead of browsing through that host and clusters view, I have this, which is actually a little bit cleaner. And let's take this example here. I've got DAS, direct attached storage. I've got NAS, right? So I've got some network attached storage and some SAN volumes, right? So I've got a good nomenclature. And then when I expand these, of course, I see the different VMs that are on here. And then every time this job runs, it just re-inventories that. So this organic growth that's going to happen here will be updated every time. That particular one has a lot on it. But the takeaway is I could have a backup job per data store or a job that has multiple data stores on here, and then every virtual machine that's on here will be inventoried. The deduplication will actually go across all of these different data stores, but it's most important to note that all added VMs will be included. Now, that's one example of a way to do it, but let's say you've got some one-offs, and we all have our one-offs, don't we? Here's an Exchange server, not huge, but I do have an Exchange server. And when I do my backups, I got to make sure that, again, I'm taking care of my application. So by default, and I have it turned on here, is what we call application-aware processing. This does a lot of great things. It enables a consistent backup through VSS, which is a framework for Windows consistency. But also important right here is that it truncates the logs. This is important for Exchange because you don't want your logs to get out of hand. So right here, by default, if I turn on application-aware processing, I'm taking care of the logs, which is great. And that way I really don't have to worry about some of the issues that may come around. Now, I mentioned the word cloud, and if you've been following Veeam recently, you might notice that we have launched our Cloud Edition. So I've got a job set up that I just launched right here. I'm going to go over and show you this real quick. And we have launched our Cloud Storage Gateway. So once the backups land on disk, and in this case they are landing here, I have a local disk that's a deduplicated volume. I have some Veeam backups here. This particular example is Hyper-V, but it's VMware or Hyper-V for this feature. It doesn't matter at all. So I've got my full backup, 48 gig, and then some incrementals like this. And basically what I'm doing over here is I just launched a job, and it's underway. Okay, it's moving along swiftly. And what this job does, once the backup job happens, it's done right there. It's actually going to kick off. Let's see if I can catch it. Get them both up here. It's going to kick off a backup to the cloud. So it hands it right off to our Cloud Storage Gateway, and the one that just turned green there, that's the cloud backup running. So just like that, once the on-site backup happened, I'm now sending that incremental data up to the cloud. And I'm actually sending what we call our Veeam metadata file to the cloud also, the VBM. So this particular cloud is Amazon, and I'm limiting my bandwidth to 1 megabyte per second. And I'm putting my incremental data up there, and this will be not even a minute or two long. So right there, I've provided myself 2 layers of protection, one of which being off-site. I like this new thing. This is new, just came out on Monday from Veeam, and I'm estimating that my Amazon storage is $8.94 a month. Okay, so that's me. I'm not using Glacier. I'm not using reduced redundancy. I'm using the full S3 storage. But basically, I just then took a 58-second backup to move a backup up to the cloud. And that was a small example. I'll give you that. So I can look at some history here. And I can, let's take the biggest one I had. It's 46 gigs. Took me about 12 hours. Again, I limit my bandwidth to 1 megabyte per second. But you get the point here that I've got a really good way, and it hands right off from the Veeam backup job to do off-site storage with cloud technologies. Good stuff, and that's new. And if you don't like Amazon, that's no problem. We have 14 different or 15 different public cloud storage providers, including OpenStack if you have a cloud of your own. And then here's a good one, file system storage. If by chance you have different storage resources in your environment, yet you want Veeam backups to be replicated between them, this can help you. This will actually take it, say, from one NAS resource to local disk on another system, or from one SAN to another SAN, as long as we can access them in Windows. A lot of flexibility with this, right? So we can use this technique more than just sending to clouds. And of course, the household names are there: Amazon, Azure, Google storage, HP storage, right? All the big ones are there, and I'm sure probably some you haven't heard of are on there also. And they each have their own options, right? So here's my Amazon S3 account. I've got my bucket defined. I also have a option here to set my price and then set a limit if it goes over a certain price. And lastly, I can even make a drive letter that says, hey, this drive letter is my bucket. We don't want to write our backups there, but it's a great way to look at what's on the storage cloud, or delete it if we wanted to, the house clean on our own. But this backup plan that we have has its own logic. Basically, we set this up, say which bucket, in this case Amazon is configured for me, and I am going to do this advanced mode where I have some encryption, but I drag down and find the path that I want to back up, and I have a very, very deep path here. So there we go, there's the backup job that I'm backing up. I'm going to do everything, but if I just wanted to do VBKs, not the incremental data, if I wanted to save bandwidth, I could do that, right? You have some granularity. We're technical people, right? We want those knobs and dials. Good stuff. And also I can drop in encryption, which is important. And in fact, I can drop in many types of encryption. That's important also. And I like this one here. There's this notion of a purge. And this number 3 right here will actually keep 3 versions of the file that we've changed. And then optionally right here, I could keep an optional 30-day trailing window of retention. So after I delete something, I'll leave it in Amazon for an extra 30 days. There you go. That's another point of recovery for you. Good stuff. That's pretty much Veeam Backup Cloud Edition. And that's the new stuff. That's kind of why I wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at that. So hopefully that helped. But the real takeaway is that Veeam Backup and Replication is powerful, easy to use, and affordable, and we want to be there for all of your VMware virtual machines. And hopefully we can build that data protection best practice for your VMware virtual machines around Veeam. We would like to really say that Veeam is built for virtualization, modern technology, cloud computing, x86 virtualization. That's where we play. And the cloud storage discussion, that's a factor. I had to explain cloud technologies once to someone, and I said, if you look up in the sky, what can you tell me about clouds? And the answer I was looking for, I didn't get it, but the answer I was looking for is that all clouds are different, and that's true. So are everyone's cloud requirements. So is cloud storage right today? That's a good question, right? We have an option for you if you're interested, and I personally like it. I'm using it, as you see. Good stuff, and actually I've been using something like this for a while. So I personally, in my own approach, I've been using data protection in the cloud for a while. But it's worth checking out. The Cloud Edition, like I just showed, basically takes that on-site data and moves it to a public storage cloud. Now it's important to note it still lives on-site, so that backup repository, we still want that high-performance recovery on-site. The recovery options with Cloud Edition actually do bring the data back on-site, so it's not a recovery to the cloud in this initial release. So that's kind of an important distinguisher, which makes sense, because if I have an internal virtual machine, restoring it to the cloud might not be the best option right away. Okay, so that as we kind of wrap up here, I want to just kind of summarize that Veeam Backup and Replication is built for virtualization, and I didn't really talk about the scalable solution. I did talk about agentless, but scalable is an important topic. Basically, depending on the size of your VMware environment, we can help you out. We can grow with it. We can be a small shop and back up to single host or Essentials Plus cluster, not a problem. But basically, whatever the size of the VMware data center, we can basically tune and scale the solution to meet it. And a lot of knobs and dials. I talked about the vSphere APIs for data protection, change block tracking. I didn't really mention that, but that really helps the performance of our backups. I think we've thrown out 90% performance improvement for incremental backups because we don't have to traverse the whole disk. The vSphere hypervisor is telling us what's changed. Good stuff. I mentioned Veeam Explorer for SAN Snapshots earlier, but if you're using HP StoreVirtual storage, this is a great technology. I really encourage you to check it out. But basically, you can restore an entire virtual machine, files and folders from the guest file system, and even exchange items right from a SAN snapshot. So this is not a replacement for backups. It's very important to note that really you still want both. So again, another layer, another type of protection is possible here, in that you'll have your backups taken with Veeam, say every night, which is a common schedule. But yet during the day, maybe you'll take these low-impact SAN snapshots and have these additional recovery points for those daily disasters. Right? So this is an option as well. And in particular, the StoreVirtual snapshot engine is very efficient and very low impact. I encourage you to check that out, and this is also included in the free edition. Now, Veeam Explorer for Exchange, this is actually my favorite one. Again, we have to take care of our applications as a best practice for our backups, and the restore is just as important with that. So all editions of Veeam Backup and Replication, including the free edition, allow us to open the EDB file. Now, this sounds a little bit crazy, but literally it's a browser into the Exchange database. And from there, you can search, you can restore, and with the exception of the free edition, you can actually put these items back in the mailbox. So let me give you an example. User deletes their email. In the free edition, you can open it, you can forward it back to them, you can save it as a PST, you can save it as an MSG. But with the paid edition, and specifically the enterprise edition, you can actually inject it back into their mailbox. Now you can also, if you wanted to, move one or more items back into a different mailbox, even in a different Exchange organization. I had someone actually recently use this as a migration tool because their company was being acquired and part of it was being divested, but they were going to two different Exchange organizations. For the small group that was being divested to another organization, they actually used Veeam Explorer for Exchange to migrate them to a new Exchange organization. Good stuff. So the takeaway here is that Veeam is modern data protection that is built for virtualization, and we like to say that we're powerful, easy to use, and affordable. So I tried to talk a lot about a lot of different things here today, and you guys have been a great crowd. I do have some questions coming in, which is awesome. But basically, you know, when we're built for virtualization, it opens up a new approach, right? And if you're not familiar with Veeam, we really encourage you to check it out. The trial editions and the free products make that quite easy to do. So let's go over to the Q&A, and I've got a couple in here. And if you have a question, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A. And if you're sticking around for the book, hold on. We'll transition to that in a moment. So Andy asks, I have a question related to small business servers. How do you do it? We've managed to hack it, and it sounds like you've had a little, you went on with a couple of examples there, Andy. You know, the key thing with small business server will be application-aware processing. Now, it is supported, but myself, I've not used much with it. I do encourage you to go to the forums and maybe do a quick search, Andy, on SBS, which is the second to last link here. People who are using SBS are discussing it. Our product management, our tech support, myself, a lot of people are on there, as well as other users. Well, hey, this is what I did, or hey, here's my script for this. Great resource. I encourage you to check that out. Patrick asks, are you going to do a short Exchange item level recovery video? I can if you'd like, since you asked. Sure, let's do that real quick. If I go over here, and if I want to do a restore, it's very simple, VMware, what type of restore? Application item, Microsoft Exchange. Now here's the magic, Patrick. What Veeam Explorer for Exchange does is it actually finds our Exchange server, and I have it named accordingly just, you know, for easy demo use. Find the point in time that we do our backups. I did one 2 hours, an hour and a half ago locally here. I'm going to take the most recent one. And I'm going to go ahead and launch this up. And basically, Veeam Explorer for Exchange will mount the Veeam backup file and browse into the file system of this virtual machine, which was called vexdemo-02, because I messed up the first one. But basically, we're going to browse that file system. And what we actually do is we read the Windows log of the VM and say, hey, where is a log entry that says starting Exchange databases? So if I find the EDB files in a log entry on this backup file, I'll go ahead and open them up in this tool. Now I could browse through and just find the EDB files, but I'm going to let the logic do its thing real quick. So I'll let that stop for a second. And I'm also going to get something else up here because I want to show you guys another thing real quick. Got a lot going on here. Busy day. Hope everybody's Valentine's Day is going well. We celebrate that here in the United States. I'm sure many of you do as well. So I just switched over to getting something ready for the Q&A. But basically, we're reading the Windows log, and we're going to find the EDB files. Now, this particular Exchange server has 2 EDB files. And I set that up on purpose because I realized that you might have multiple databases on an Exchange VM. And in this particular case, we're going to load it, and we're doing a quick index of the contents of that. So what mailboxes, what folders are in place, etc. We're not actually looking at the whole database. We're only just doing a quick index. So here it is, Patrick. We expand it, and there are the usernames on this mailbox. I'm going to go into this particular username, and I think there's like 50,000 items in this mailbox. So this is kind of a good example here. It's either 50 or 5. So it's a lot, or it's 30. So it used to be 5, now it's 30. So basically I have this particular inbox, and I can open up this guy. And this actually is just filled with Veeam log message. So these particular mailboxes are my demo mailboxes. Some of them are from me, but again, they're backup logs, okay? So basically, once I have these, I can actually go over here and do the restore situations. So I've just opened it, but I could also save it as an MSG file, you know, the Outlook format. I could also forward it if I had Outlook installed. Now I don't have Outlook installed here. And I can also export it to a PST, which actually might be more efficient if I had multiple, for example. Or if I wanted to do the whole folder, I could put it as a PST. Now this option right here to restore it back to the mailbox, that's pretty powerful as well. But I also have some discovery capabilities. So I could look for, I know that there's some messages from Chewbacca, or mentioned the words Chewbacca. So you see I just typed and I had a quick little search. So a quick way to view Veeam Explorer for Exchange, Patrick. Hopefully that helped you. Hopefully that was beneficial. So let's go to Andy, check the forums. Patrick, hopefully that helped. Martin asks, is there an additional license fee for Cloud Edition, or is it covered with active support? Martin, if you're an active customer, there is an add-on for Cloud Edition. So the Cloud Storage Gateway is not included with existing support. It's a new product in that sense. So check with your sales team. Sander, will Veeam Explorer for Exchange support Exchange 2003? No. It is supported for Exchange 2010. Exchange 2013 is going to be released very soon. And for those of you who have asked a couple of times, you will get a copy of these slides and a link to replay the webinar sent in a few days to the email that you registered with. Iqbal asks, so I show you how to back up a whole VM or data store, but can we back up specific files or folders in a VM? No, Iqbal. We are an image-based backup of the whole VM. We can exclude VMDKs, but we couldn't, say, just back up the data directory on this Windows drive letter. Craig asks, is the license for the software unlimited? Kind of. Let me change your question a little bit, Craig. Our license is per CPU socket. So if we have a 2-socket VMware host and we have 5 of those, we would need 10 Veeam licenses. And those 10 licenses would enable us to have an unlimited number of virtual machines, an unlimited array of applications, so we don't have Exchange or SQL agents, for example. And then also, we would not be worried about how many terabytes you're backing up. Now, if you're using the Cloud Edition, we do not include the cloud storage. So that Amazon account would be separate from that. Hope that answers your question, Craig. Okay, we are almost out of time. I am going to switch up just a little bit real quick, and we're going to transition to the Q&A where you can win a book. And actually, sorry, this is the question I'm looking for here. So basically, I'm going to ask you one question, and the first 7 people who answer this correctly will win their choice of these popular books. The one I'm recommending right now is the 5.1 Clustering Deep Dive for vSphere, but I got some other ones that are on there that are excellent as well. Okay, get your Q&A panel ready. Here is the question. There's one word that I used a lot at the beginning of the webinar as a protection and a performance technique. What word did I use? And a lot of people already got it. And the word was separation. Verenda, that's not the right answer, but I'll give you, you're a winner for that. That's a good one. So it's actually going to be 7 plus 1. Verenda, Greg, Dan, Gavin, GE, Ryan, Raghavir, and Patrick. I think that's what you're trying to do. You guys are all winners. You guys have been an excellent crowd. I appreciate everyone for attending and sticking around to the end of this webinar. I hope you found this valuable, as well as, if you had some Veeam questions, and everybody should be able to take something away. All right, everyone. Thanks again for attending, and that concludes today's featured webinar.